Voters. Thanks so much for coming today, and it's good to see some new faces. I'm sure you're here because of our topic today, and we're glad to see you. The League League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that has been in existence since the days of women's suffrage. We focus on voters' rights, voter education, citizen participation in government, civil rights, social justice, those sorts of issues that affect all our people. And we try to get people to be more actively involved in the processes that affect. Just recently, we've started a new effort here with the Macon County League. We're going to be having action alerts. When we hear of issues that we hope people will become involved in and speak out on, we're going to have a column in the newspaper, email, little action alerts, blurbs, and hopefully give people a chance to get involved earlier on. I know a lot of us get frustrated because things happen and you don't really know what's happening until it's done. And so we're trying to monitor websites, newsletters, broadcasts, all that sort of thing to bring information to people a little earlier on in the game. Today's program is on hydraulic fracturing or fracking. As I said, the League is nonpartisan, but we take very strong positions on issues. And the National League publishes statements on many important issues, and I want to just read you briefly the current League statement that would have effect on fracking. At its 2010 National Convention, the League of Women Voters U.S. unanimously adopted a resolution to support safe drilling and mining practices. We support the significant strengthening of appropriate regulation, oversight, inspection, and penalties associated with the development of fossil fuel resources. This strengthening includes the elimination from national legislation of the exemptions for drilling and mining, as well as additional legislation requiring the federal agencies to regulate drilling and mining in a manner consistent with the preservation of a healthy environment. It's a long statement, I won't read it all, but I will mention that it also calls for full disclosure of pollution data, management of land as a finite resource, not as a commodity, identification and regulation of areas of critical concern, including aquifers and recharge areas, policies to ensure safe treatment, transportation, storage, and disposal of solid and hazardous waste in order to protect public health and air, water, and land resources. The full statement is available on the League of Women Voters site, lwv.org. And so any of you who would like to read that in full, please go to the site. But, today we are very fortunate to have with us Katie Fenn from Clean Water, North Carolina. This organization works in all sorts of things having to do with protecting our water sources and are very active on this issue of fracking. And Katie was very kind to make time for us in her very busy schedule, and we thank you and welcome.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks to the League of Women Voters for inviting me, and I'm glad I could make it out today to talk with all of you. Clean Water for North Carolina is a 29-year-old environmental justice organization, and we have offices in Asheville and Durham, North Carolina. And we've been tracking and advocating on this issue in North Carolina for about 3 years, really ever since natural gas was essentially discovered in the state and the policies began changing. We've been working on it. So I'm going to go through an overview. Let's see. I'm going to go through an overview with you of the process, a little bit about the national level, and then focus in on the specifics in North Carolina. And I think a few of the themes that you'll pick up on in this presentation is that this is a very current issue that's being considered in Raleigh. The policies are changing very fast. And you'll also see a lot of the reasons why North Carolina is not even a very good candidate for this type of drilling. And yet, the legislature that we currently have in has been attempting to legalize it in a very industry-friendly way. So any advocacy that you feel moved to do with your state legislators will go a long way. I was going to say briefly, we're a water protection group, so you may wonder, why are we involved in something like energy issues? As you can imagine, there's a really strong link between our water resources and a lot of energy extraction, production, combustion. So we tend to interface a lot with those issues. As I said, we're an environmental justice organization, and with fracking, we recognized very quickly that the land around the studied shale basins in North Carolina has a lot of renters, a lot of rural folks, low-income folks who would be most vulnerable to these impacts. And then finally, we do focus pretty strongly on drinking water, and there's mounting evidence that hydraulic fracturing can affect drinking water resources. You can skip that one. All right, so just a brief overview, what is fracking or hydraulic fracturing? This next diagram will show you, if you can advance. The EPA puts out this very simplistic diagram. It basically shows the process, and a lot of you may be somewhat familiar with this, but essentially hydraulic fracturing is the process of injecting large volumes of water underground mixed with sand and numerous chemicals. That's a mixture designed to smooth the process, and then by doing this at very high pressure, the rock is actually fractured. So this is deep underground. And the fractures let natural gas, which is a type known as shale gas, escape and come back up. Now, I'm not a geologist, so if you have more technical questions, I'd be glad to forward them on to our staff members who have geology in their background. But that's a very basic thing. And if you'll go to the next slide. You'll hear people say, oh, this technology has been around forever. Why is everyone suddenly complaining about it? Well, one of the things that happened is that hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling are often used together. Horizontal drilling being when you can actually turn the drill bit into the layer where the shale gas is, drill horizontally, and then reach a larger area underground. So it's true that hydraulic fracturing or fracking has been around since the 1930s, but it was some innovations in the early 90s that created the potential to access some of these resources in the Marcellus Shale and other parts of the country that had previously been untapped. And that's when it became very widespread, and without the science to back it up, people began to be really concerned. This is just a map of some of the major, what are called shale plays in the United States. You can see there are a lot out west. Texas is a big area for drilling. And then, of course, the major boom that many of you may have heard about has been taking place in the Marcellus Shale, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other areas near there. You'll notice that North Carolina doesn't have anything on this map, and that's partially because it's not big enough to be pictured on this, and partially because it's a newer area of study. So why are people concerned about this? Obviously, Clean Water for North Carolina is an advocacy organization, but we're a science-based advocacy organization. So we want to make sure that we're following the most recent science and figuring out whether there really are dangers, and I'll just talk about a few. First of all, there are a lot of impacts to the environment, and the first one really focuses around water. The process is very water intensive. It takes about 2 to up to 8 million gallons of water to frack one well, and each well can be fracked multiple times. Now, when that water returns to the surface, some of it does, not the entire amount, it's still laced with the chemicals used to smooth the process, and those include a number of carcinogens and other compounds that can be toxic. So it's not easy to reclaim. It's prohibitively expensive at this point. I know there's research going on, but basically once the water comes back up, it just has to be disposed of. It's pretty hard to treat, so it's essentially gone from the useful system for quite some time. I've got a slide a little later on when I get into talking about the policy around this that explains the disclosure of those chemicals and why it's been hard for the public health community to know what they are, because there aren't rules requiring their disclosure except for at the state level. There have also been scientifically studied instances of groundwater contamination. And if I kind of skipped over this when I showed you the diagram, but typically this shale layer is far down below the aquifer or drinking water layer where most people's private wells or community water systems would be drawing water out of. However, as you can imagine, it's a complex system, and fractures can form or connect up to existing fractures, natural fractures. And so there have been instances where people's wells were contaminated with sediment, methane, which is the gas itself, which can lead to the water being flammable, and also other volatile organic compounds that are used in the fracking fluid. I think I failed to bring, we do have a list of peer-reviewed journal articles. If you're interested in that bibliography, let me know and I can send that to you. But one of the first studies to specifically link fracking to methane contamination in wells actually came out of Duke University in North Carolina, and they were studying Pennsylvania. So that was very interesting. I think that was in 2011. This also has a big impact on air quality, as you can imagine if you've ever walked by a natural gas line and smelled that methane smell. There are a lot of leaks from the gas infrastructure all along the lines, not just at the well pads where drilling's going on. And but at the well pads themselves, there are numerous issues with flaring off, and sometimes drilling companies, if they can't use all of the capacity right then, they'll just burn off the gas just to do something with it, which seems kind of wasteful. But there are a lot of instances, and if you've seen the film Gasland, which is a documentary, it goes into the situation in a little town in Texas, which has a lot of infrastructure coming together right there and had really high levels of benzene in the air. So air quality is definitely a concern. And then I did want to mention, because a lot of people will say that natural gas is better for the climate. And the current science, of course, shows that natural gas does burn very clean. So if you have a natural gas-fired power plant, the emissions from the plant itself are very low. However, the pure methane gas that's coming to and from the plant, emissions from the lines where there are leaks, is actually a very potent greenhouse gas. And scientists are finding that in the short term, it, in a sense, can even be more impactful and harmful than carbon dioxide, but then it doesn't have as long a lifetime in the atmosphere. Okay. This just shows a few other ways that water contamination can happen throughout this process. It shows, fractures that form. There are also failed casings, as it turns out, as with the BP oil spill, the equipment itself can fail. There are also, all along the transport process, ways for the waste fluids to get out and contaminate water. So this kind of goes side by side with the environmental impacts, but obviously if there are people living around these areas, there can be health effects, and there have been several studies about this done as well. So a lot of the methane gas has caused communities to feel like they were experiencing health issues, and then the drinking water contamination in some cases as well. But I think that the air quality can be one of the scariest parts of this in terms of people feeling an impact. And also, as it turns out, the industry has a very high incidence of accidents for their workers and their truck drivers. So that's just one other way that health could be affected. You know, as I'm not a geologist, I don't always think about how unpredictable it is underground, and I know there is a lot of science about how fractures work, but in a sense, when human-induced fractures come into the mix, there is a lot of unpredictability, and this is just one example. In Canada, this happened, I guess, about 2 years ago. There was an oil well blowout, huge damage, and you could see the oil coming out. And this happened as a result of another well that was fracked over a half-mile away. So it just shows that, you know, there can be a lot of interconnection that we don't understand that can travel pretty good distances and affect other surface areas. In terms of the economy, studies out of Cornell and other universities have shown, in Pennsylvania, where this is all very new, they're starting to reach the point where they can study the economic impacts and finding that it's kind of a typical boom-bust cycle for a community. There's only a certain amount of natural gas, and it's, you know, once it's gone, the industry packs up and moves away. It also tends to employ people from out of state, experienced folks or part-time. So a lot of the North Carolina legislators have argued about jobs, and yet the study that our state Department of Environment and Natural Resources has done showed that the industry maximum might employ about 380 people a year for 7 years. I believe that's the right number, but I'd need to check exactly. But in terms of other industries, other types of things we could be investing in, it doesn't really bring the jobs that a lot of folks promise. You know, there are some other miscellaneous social concerns that have people a little worried about this practice, and one is simply the increased volume of truck traffic. Some operations are using pipelines to bring in water and to take out gas. Some are using trucks to bring in all of these millions of gallons of water. And so the impacts on local infrastructure could be extensive, and a lot of states don't have policies that ensure that local communities can get the coverage they need and the bonds that they need to cover those extra expenses of repairing the roads. Obviously, noise pollution can be a problem with these, and if you look at pictures of the Marcellus Shale, where this is largely going on in rural and suburban areas, you can see houses that are literally back to back with a drilling rig. And I haven't been up there, but at almost every meeting there's somebody who is from that area or has family there and has seen this for themselves. So it can be pretty disruptive in a community. And I'll talk a little bit more about the landowner piece, which, just to let you know, in North Carolina, this would largely be happening, if it's permitted, on private land. So we're talking about landowners leasing the mineral rights to a company. In some states, there's a lot of gas overlaying with public lands, and that's a totally separate issue that we haven't followed as closely just because we're a North Carolina-based organization, but that is another concern on the national scale. Speaking of national scale, Susan mentioned in the League of Women Voters statement that the League had taken this resolution wanting the reinstatement of national laws and removing exemptions. What that refers to is that in 2005, in the Energy Policy Act passed by Congress, there was a piece in it that's nicknamed the Halliburton loophole. And Halliburton is, of course, one of the companies that leads the industry. And what that did is it exempted the oil and gas industry from the large part of our national environmental laws. So the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so some of these rules that we assume apply to industry don't actually apply to this industry. And that's why there hasn't been a lot of information and data available, and the Environmental Protection Agency at a national level is now trying to play catch up and study it somewhat, but still does not have the teeth to get in and get that data and hold these companies accountable to these laws. So what that means is that it falls to each state to protect its resources in what way it sees possible and good. And so, you know, it's a very patchwork situation nationally. And there have been studies looking at agencies in, for example, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Arkansas. You know, how many wells are actually being inspected? Are there serious violations? Have nearby residents been notified? And they found that in all three of those areas, it was very lacking. So the regulation is really not there to keep up, though, as I said, it really varies by state. This just gives you an example of one type of policy. This is about chemical disclosure, what's in that mix of water and chemicals that's being injected. And you can see how much it varies state to state. The white states are where there's no fracking going on yet. So as you can see, this is happening in a large majority of our country. But because like Coca-Cola or McDonald's recipes, these mixtures, these blends are considered to be trade secrets for each company. They don't want each other stealing their recipe. In most states, there's not a strict requirement that that information be made public. And I'll talk a little bit more about North Carolina when I get to our state portion, but just most types of policies and regulations would look something like this. It would be very different depending on where you are. Okay, so this is the part that I know a little bit better, but that just gives you some context. To give you an idea, in 2008, the Geologic Survey came out with some new information, and they discovered that there are these basins, Triassic basins. They were areas that were formed during the Triassic period that potentially contain shale gas. And you can see this is the central part of the state, and you can see that the Deep River Basin is the larger of the two, and that's, you know, just just west of Raleigh through the Durham County and then down through Lee, Moore, Chatham counties, if you're familiar with that area. And then there's a little bit up near the Virginia border in Stokes and Rockingham County. And so that came out, and all of the chaos around state policy and regulation ensued. This is a topic many of you may be very interested in. There are also some unassessed basins that have come up in geologic studies here and there, but have not been quantifiably, addressed. How much gas could actually be extracted here? One of them is the Davie Basin, which is just a little dot in Davie and Yadkin counties, and then the Cumberland Marlborough down around Fayetteville. But you may have heard in the news last month about suddenly state regulators talking about studying Western North Carolina. And of course, everyone in the mountains got really surprised and shocked, and so did those of us who had been following policy in Raleigh, because no one had been talking about this. But upon investigation and good investigative reporting from some local reporters, we found that what they may have been referring to is this brown region called the Murphy Belt. which contains metamorphic rock, and you can see where Macon and Jackson County are on the map. And there are just many, many unknowns about this. There's no guarantee that it even contains the right type of rock to potentially have shale gas. And the rumors just came from this statement by Mitch Gillespie, former pro-fracking legislator who now works for the DENR regulatory agency, saying that they were going to spend some money testing, and someone had mentioned that's a very small amount of money to try and find out anything about the feasibility of drilling. But everyone seems to think it's very slim, and best guess, the industry proponents and the policymakers who really want to see this come to North Carolina want to look like they're exploring all their options and welcoming the industry in with open arms. But we definitely are going to be tracking this very closely, and we'll be glad to keep you all informed, because I think, it is kind of nerve-wracking to think that this could possibly be happening in the western part of the state as well. And before I go on, I do have a petition that we have been gathering signatures on. It's to the elected leaders of North Carolina. And I'm going to pass this around, I guess, as I'm finishing up, so that if you're interested in signing, you can. And if you put down your email, I can get you onto our Frack Updates email list, which comes out twice a week, which has national, state news, and advocacy steps you can take in North Carolina as this process moves forward. So I guess I'll just start this around. Okay. As it turns out, even the assessed basins in North Carolina, the ones that have been studied, have a very small amount of natural gas. The estimates were lowered last year. Initially, it was thought to be greater, and now it's thought to be possibly 1 to 5 years of North Carolina's natural gas demand if it all stayed in the state. So that's not a whole lot. You can see the comparison to some of the other larger shale basins in the country. So it's not a lot of gas, and it is a very extensive amount of regulatory programs and infrastructure that needs to go into place to try to access it. There's also an increased risk, we feel, in North Carolina, though it needs to be studied more, because the shale gas layer is very close to the surface. In the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, a typical depth for the shale layer would be 10,000 feet down. Now, on this cross-section, you can see where 7,000 feet is, and then you can see where the gray shale area is, and this is North Carolina's Deep River Basin. So, that's 2,000 feet or shallower, and even coming up to the surface in some places, very close to the drinking water layer, and there are a lot of folks on wells and groundwater systems in that part of the state. There's also a higher population density in those parts of North Carolina than anywhere else this is being done, as I understand it. So this is actually showing you, the Southern Environmental Law Center put this map together. The yellow dots are public water supplies that rely on groundwater. So you can see there are a lot that coincide with that stretch of area. I said I would talk a little bit more about landowner protection. And one thing about North Carolina that's different from Colorado or Texas, maybe a little more similar to Pennsylvania, but even there's been a lot of coal extraction, is that we're not a very experienced state. We haven't had a whole lot of extraction. I know there was some mining in this end of the state, but in terms of extensive, prolonged mining and the things that go along with it, there just isn't a lot. So there aren't as many experienced attorneys who know about split estates and the types of contracts people would be signing to lease their mineral rights. And people are vulnerable to those documents, which can be very tricky. They can be what's called predatory leases, which put a lot of the burdens and responsibilities on the landowner and very few on the company. And there's also another issue that I won't go into really a lot because I don't want to run out of time, but in a lot of states, something called compulsory or forced pooling is legal, and North Carolina is considering and has in fact recommended that we adopt this as well. This is where if a certain percentage of your neighbors have signed their mineral rights on a lease, and you are within a tract of land that is going to be drilled, essentially your mineral rights are forfeit. You're forced into letting the industry drill there. And so, this is something that has a lot of people very upset, especially who are strong believers in property rights and being able to control what happens on your land and under your land. So in North Carolina, the rule will be if 90% of a certain tract of land have signed, then everyone else is kind of forced in. I can talk a little bit more about that after if you're interested. And then the other thing here is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a lot of people on wells in this area and a lot of renters who maybe live near someone with a large enough area of land that they would want to lease their rights. But the renters, wouldn't get any of the potential financial benefits or royalties. They could be impacted without any of the benefits. So as an environmental justice organization, we're very concerned about those folks. In terms of the law, we were very lucky in North Carolina starting off because for a long time the state had prioritized groundwater and that its best use was as drinking water. And therefore, it was illegal to drill horizontally. It was illegal to inject wastes that could contaminate groundwater, and it was illegal to do high pressure, that says resher, but it should say pressure, high pressure injection and fracturing. So that was the sort of legal landscape that existed in 2008 when the shale basins were discovered. Since then, our legislature has acted very quickly to rush into allowing this process. In 2012, Senate Bill 820 passed, and this removed the prohibitions, basically all of those except for the one about injecting waste underground. And it created a Mining and Energy Commission. This is the rule-making body down in Raleigh that is currently making all of the rules that will make up how the industry is regulated. But it also placed essentially a moratorium on actual drilling beginning in the state. It gave the Mining and Energy Commission a couple of years to write this whole new body of rules, which is actually not even long enough to really consider it very thoroughly, and then said, once the rules are developed, the legislature can come back and vote to allow permitting of drillers to begin. Governor Perdue, thanks to a lot of enthusiastic grassroots folks throughout the state who called her, actually vetoed this bill, and she received more calls in her office on this particular piece of legislation, she said, than on anything else in her term. But unfortunately, her veto was overridden by a very narrow margin in a late night vote, so this did stand. In 2013, the rush to continue to make it easy for industry to start drilling continued, but grassroots pressure has really held off some of the worst provisions that we saw introduced in Raleigh. For example, there was an attempt to take away that final legislative approval and just allow permitting automatically next spring. That did not get through. There was also an attempt to legalize wastewater injection, which is one of the ways that companies in other parts of the country are disposing of the fluid that comes back up out of the wells is just take it somewhere else and inject it underground. This has proved very dangerous. It has actually led to some seismic impacts and small earthquakes in places like Ohio. And the coastal region got pretty upset about this because they had the aquifers thought most likely to receive all of those wastes. And the rule that was proposed also would have allowed North Carolina to begin accepting waste fluids from other states to inject underground. So it really would have opened up a whole can of worms, but luckily that also did not pass. And there were a couple of other provisions that seemed hasty and not in the best interest of communities that did not pass. Okay. There was also an attempt to introduce a very, very weak chemical disclosure policy in North Carolina. You saw that map with all of the different colors, and a lot of those were pretty weak policies, but there was something going around, and I don't know the specifics, but it said that this would have been the weakest chemical disclosure policy in the nation. Essentially, it would not have allowed the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to hold on to the specific chemical names and even, disclose them as needed. The public would not have access to that, and just would have a list of the families of chemicals involved, which isn't very specific. That is kind of the very minimum. So that also did not pass. And preemption of local ordinances has been a very big issue, not just on fracking, but in general with this General Assembly has done a lot to keep local governments from making decisions that are stronger than what the state decides should be the minimum environmental protections. And this came at a time when quite a few local governments had already passed resolutions or ordinances that ban this practice, the fracking. But that did not get through, but it continues to be, it remains to be seen if drilling begins in North Carolina, whether local ordinances will hold up against state law. The Mining and Energy Commission itself is made up of appointees from both the governor and the legislature, and all but one of them are very pro-drilling. They want to see this come to North Carolina and are not as concerned about impacts to other areas of our economy and environment. And they have a very large task ahead of them. They have 130 regulations to make by this fall, which will then be out there for the public to comment on. And, as our state leadership has changed, they're also using this language of not wanting the regulations to be too burdensome to the drillers. So there's more of a focus on easing the passage for industry and less on what's really best for North Carolina communities. So some of the controversial rules that they've been reviewing recently, and I believe the chemical disclosure rule is coming up in committee again next week. So they're making a rule on chemical disclosure. They have suggested the rule on forced pooling of landowners, and they're also considering any baseline testing that will be done of water and air to see what changes if and when drilling begins. So in response to this, an alliance of nonprofit organizations and grassroots concerned citizens groups throughout the state have formed, calling themselves the Frack Free NC Alliance. As the name implies, all of these groups would prefer to not see fracking begin in North Carolina at all because of a lot of the aforementioned impacts and the sensitive geology and probability that the rules will not be very strong. Currently, many of these groups are based within those studied shale basin areas, so there are a lot of people who could be directly impacted. But the movement is definitely growing, and any local organization is encouraged to join. There are weekly phone calls and a very active grassroots organizing and tracking all of the policy that goes on. So to close and have a chance to take questions, a few things that you can do if you want to learn more or are concerned. One is to sign the petition that I passed around. We are hoping to get 50,000 signatures on this petition, and I wish I knew how many we had so far, but I don't. You can consider a local resolution in your community. These have been, I thought I had a slide, but I guess I don't. But I believe there are 8 or 10 municipalities and 2 counties so far that have done this. Anson County, which is near Charlotte, and Creedmoor, North Carolina, have ordinances banning fracking. And if this is something that anyone in this area is interested in, we do have a lot of resources, examples of language for those. It sends a really strong message, I think, to the legislature as well as local leaders. If you are opposed to this, or at least the way that it's being done now, one of the most important things you can do is contact your state senator, state representative. Because the legislature has to vote to allow permitting next spring in 2015, that vote will determine whether a moratorium stays in place or whether drilling begins. And that vote obviously comes from all across the state. So we know that a lot of legislators are hearing from their constituents and taking it very seriously. So if you need more information about that, I'd be happy to provide it. This fall, as I mentioned, the Mining and Energy Commission rules will also be up for public input. And there's also an opportunity to learn more and see a documentary coming up in March at the Franklin Public Library. There will be 2 showings of Gasland 2, which is the sequel to Gasland that is newly out. It's a little bit of a long film, but we try to condense where we can because it can get a little lengthy. But if you haven't seen Gasland 1 and you're interested, I believe that's available on Netflix, and you can buy it online on DVD. It's around. And they have it at the library, so you can go check it out. But 4:30 and 7 p.m. on March 12th, that's correct, isn't it? Thank you. And my colleague from Asheville, Sally Morgan, will be attending to give an update as well. So that was the presentation I had prepared, and there are usually questions and comments. So thanks for holding your questions till the end, and I would be happy to address any that I can. Yes?
What's the purpose of the chemicals and things that are put into the water?
It varies. Some of them are like to make it more viscous so that it flows. Some of them are to, I don't have the technical grasp, but there are purposes. As you can imagine, it's a pretty complex process to pull a gas out from rock fractures. So a lot of the chemicals speed that up or in some way help the process. There are other things injected rather than water. I know hydrogen, I believe, is used in some places, and there are a couple of other mixtures being studied by some of the industry developers. Well, it fractures the rock by the sheer pressure is my rudimentary understanding. But there are some good resources on the internet about the process itself. And if you come to the film in March, my colleague Sally has a geology background, so she can answer all of your questions. I shouldn't commit her to that, but I will. Yes?
action with this chemical disclosure? None of the companies have to disclose what chemicals they're using?
On a national scale, there is no overarching policy, and that's because they're exempt from the laws that would typically require that. But in individual states, sometimes they are required in that state. Some states have a policy where medical professionals who are trying to treat patients can access the information to see what they may have been exposed to. But it's still not publicly available, but that's at least a step, because it's really hard for the doctors to diagnose people when they don't know what could have been what they could have been exposed to. So there has not been any, umbrella law made that would remediate that. But there are a couple of scientists, Theo Colborn, who you may have heard of, it basically identified almost all of the constituents in the mixture just in a lab, so that the public would at least know what those were, and it's something like 600 different chemicals. So that's at least out there. You can look at that list. Yeah.
Can I just say did you say that Diener spent or spending $11,000 on research?
Yeah, let me go back to that. Mitch Gillespie said offhandedly in a meeting that they were planning to spend that much studying some area of Western North Carolina, but in following up, no one has been able to confirm with other people in the agency that that's planned or any details about it. So, he said that, but there's no evidence that that is actually going to happen.
But is it normal that Diener would spend the money? It's our money to do the investigation.
Yes, they're spending a large amount of money on this Mining and Energy Commission process to set up the regulatory program. And, it's taxpayer money, so that's another argument against it if there's really not going to be a lot of drilling done in the end. I think you were going to ask something.
If I'm not mistaken, our state senator, Jim Davis, voted for both of these bills, 76 and 820, that would have rushed this through. And also for a bill that would prohibit any local governments from having any regulations tighter than the state. Do you know if that's right or not?
That is correct. These bills in Raleigh is very divided and partisan right now. These bills essentially went along party lines, especially where there was the folks hadn't heard from their constituents. It may be, I know he's heard from some people about this, but maybe he just isn't educated on the issue or doesn't think that his constituents care about it. There were quite a few people, though, in some of these votes, for instance, from Stokes County, who voted against party lines because they heard from so many constituents. So despite the fact that maybe some legislators right now don't really care what their constituents think, this is an election year, and some of them, you may be surprised, some of them may come around. So that's my understanding, is that he has voted for those bills.
As part of that, I understand there is a moratorium against local governments making any changes or new environmental regulations until October of 2014. That was in response to this idea to not allow local governments to make stronger regulations. But does that mean while a county or a locale could not rule against fracking, that they can have a resolution which is a statement against fracking but is not legally binding?
I'll have to look up, I wasn't aware of the moratorium. What I do know is that the legislature made it this year so that new environmental resolutions on a local level or ordinances on a local level could not be made unless it was a unanimous vote, which makes it very difficult. But, so I'll have to get back to you on that, but these things about sort of preempting local ordinances, that doesn't mean the ordinances can't be in place. And good idea, but I'll have to get back to you on what the exact restrictions are now.
I think we would like to explore with our board and our members, the league leading an effort at getting our county to at least pass a resolution. So, we will be checking with board members and would like to proceed on looking at a county resolution if you all can help us.
We absolutely can. We have lots of resources, so just stay in touch. That'd be great. Yeah.
The Murphy Belt, looks like most of the Murphy Belt lies on public lands in western North Carolina, and I would say that the big opportunity to stop fracking in this part of the state now is with the new forest management plan. That energy issue will have to be addressed in the forest management plan. Just to give you a good, very recent example of how that's played out in Appalachia, the George Washington National Forest in Virginia, just over the line from us, issued a draft environmental impact statement on their new forest plan back in the fall. Energy companies appealed that. The fracking issue was actually, the plan had to be brought back to the drawing board, and the George Washington National Forest, which had not even thought about fracking up to that point, suddenly was head on with fracking interest. They recently, in the last week, had to amend their draft environmental impact statement. They had to go back and address the fracking issue, but they amended it, and there will be no fracking allowed in George Washington National Forest. So this is our opportunity right now in the next 3 years in western North Carolina to get a forest management plan right in the middle of the thick of it right now, where we can actually get that addressed in the forest plan.
Brand, could you
Thank
introduce
you.
yourself so people who don't know you know
I'm
who
Brent
you are?
Martin with the Wilderness Society. Our office is in Silva, and so the forest management plan revision is our top priority right now.
State or?
That's for the western part of all the national forest here, which is a little over 1 million acres. So that's 18 counties in western North Carolina, which if you look at Swain County's 87% federally owned, Graham County's 79%. A lot of these counties in western North Carolina that have Murphy Belt potential would all, I think, fall primarily on national forests. So that's what we're up against right now.
So
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it sounds like Brent and the Wilderness Society are the go-to folks for that, and maybe we can stay in touch about that forest management plan. And yeah.
I'm thinking that there are plenty of property owners out there who are probably more motivated by personal financial gain than the effect on the environment or the effect on the community and neighbors. They'd rather have a check coming in from the gas exploration company. And my question is, do you have any idea what kind of lease payments are being offered by the exploration companies? I know we're not doing it in North Carolina, but in places that are leasing property.
Well, first of all, I neglected to mention that there have been, it might have been on the slide, there have been almost 10,000 leases signed already in Lee County in North Carolina. There are landmen out there knocking on doors. My understanding is that in, for example, Pennsylvania, the leases would be for somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 or $3,000 per acre. So it's it would be a financial.
And is that per year?
That I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's just a one-time payment.
Forever? It must be a term.
I'm not as familiar with the Pennsylvania leases. I would have to get back to you, and I can. But what I know is that in North Carolina, the leases that are being offered are very predatory, according to the people who've reviewed them, in that there's almost no value per acre up front. All of the potential benefits would be in royalties, so it's all dependent on how much gas is actually found underneath the property. And so people may be signing it thinking that they're in for a big financial gain, but compared to Pennsylvania, it's very small amounts, none up front, and dependent on what's found there. But if you give me your name, I can follow up with you about the ones in other parts of the country. Yeah. Yes.
There's a very strong property rights contingent, at least our area of North Carolina, and I think that's something that we can utilize to our benefit, because your property, your water, and your land is sacred, and should be held as such. So
Sure.
I think we can lean on that as well as promote wind and solar as a viable alternative to the potential damaging expense that will never be recovered.
I think, that's definitely a strong argument, and I can provide the details of the recommendation that the commission made regarding the forced pooling. And, but it's as easy as explaining that you don't really get to decide what happens with your own property if others near you are affected. What was the other thing? Oh, and another sort of tangential item, Clean Water for North Carolina is very enthusiastic about the potential for energy efficiency practices to eliminate much of the need that this small amount of gas would fill, as well as other fossil fuels, coal, and other kinds of energy production. Studies have shown that energy efficiency actually creates more jobs per capita than some of these extraction things, and our buildings are so inefficient that a lot of energy can be saved. So obviously it's not the whole picture solution, but when we talk about wind and solar, we always talk about efficiency because there's a lot of work to be done there, I think.
I went with a small group of environmentalists to talk to Senator Davis.
Mm-hmm.
He stressed his mantra that he believed in local control.
Mm.
And so his vote there obviously shows him two-faced on that. So maybe this is a little too partisan, but that's where he could be embarrassed.
Well, especially if the county passes a resolution or some kind of statement, and you can show that to him, that, I don't know, it might carry some weight.
What vote did you say is coming up next week, or what regulation is coming up for you?
On January 14th, the Mining and Energy Commission's Chemical Disclosure Committee is meeting for the third or fourth time because they keep getting hung up on things, and will be considering that rule again. So some of those meetings have audio that you can listen to online. We do have a lot of connections who are attending those meetings and sending out notes, and if you join our email list, you'll get the highlights of that. But that's the one that they're considering next week.
Do they take comment from the public, or do they not? I mean, is
They-
that something we should do, we should take on right away as individuals, or is that not how they operate?
Yes, you can reach out and comment to them about the policy now, but they'll also all be up for public input in the fall. And as I understand it, there will be hearings, but I may have to get back to you on that. So let me follow up with you. Do you have a way to spread the word if there is
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
is recommended to do? Okay, great.
Two questions a little bit. First, in the Research Triangle area, I'm assuming the business and industry have been able to hold off any possibility in that region at all of fracking?
In the Research Triangle
Research
Park
Triangle.
area?
Yeah, since you know more a little bit about the Durham community and the organization there, it looks like the Research Triangle area may be, because of business and industry interests, been able to hold off any possible fracking in their community, or is that right?
I don't know that any particular community has been able to 100% guarantee that, but that area is very well organized and they're engaged in a lot of these statewide policy decisions. But maybe you know something that I don't about about a particular local ordinance or something?
No, it's not so much the particular ordinance, it's the business and industrial leadership that's helping to promote a lot of this in the General Assembly with their leaders, Republican leaders there. So it's a little bit of a move to protect their region. That's why I was wondering if you knew anything about that area at all.
Maybe I'm not understanding the question very well, but I do know that there are a lot of folks who might otherwise be aligned with economic development but don't want it in their backyards. There certainly are a significant amount of people who are proponents because they think that they might financially benefit from the industry in one way or another. One other thing that I'll mention, and I'm sorry if this isn't answering your question, but we can follow up, is that, in our eyes, one of the drivers of this, because the industry has said this is such a small resource, we don't really want to get involved in North Carolina, it's not worth it. So we think, just from several clues, that one of the drivers may be generally making North Carolina a very industry-friendly, deregulated place, has led to a lot of campaign money coming into the legislators who are promoting that. And we did see an increase in the last year in money coming from funders like the Koch brothers to state level races in North Carolina. So, it could be that no one will ever really benefit from the actual resource itself, but the idea that we're opening ourselves up to it may be helping a few people line their pockets.
Well, it's also interesting that the sandhills being in Lee County, being on the verge or the corner of the sandhills, that you have so many that have already gone into leasing with this organization, and yet it's right there on the verge of the sandhill area.
Yeah.
That could be most effective since the water table is right there close to it.
Yeah, it's incredible. There's a really neat organization called RAFI, if you haven't heard of them, Rural Advancement Foundation International. They're a farmers and landowners advocacy group, and they've done a lot of door-to-door work helping people understand their rights with leases and that kind of thing. So it's interesting, and who knows what's going to end up happening. Yes?
Nationwide, we watched 60 Minutes slamming clean energy last Sunday, and in truth, what they were discussing was investment processes that were losses. But this, and I didn't realize, you started your program with this, fracking has been about 8 years in the works and has been improving along lines. Much of our wind and solar energy and the network involved that will produce that energy out to people's use is still in startup. And startups are teensy. That's just how it is. But they've got to be given a chance. Other countries are making vast and great strides in clean air and natural energy. And we're sitting here going to contaminate our water, our air, our soil for growing, and it's just pathetic. I urge everybody, for heaven's sakes, call Jim Davis.
And, part of that, I listened to a meeting that was happening in Raleigh the other day that was on energy policy in North Carolina with a lot of presenters to this legislative committee, and it was a special convening because they're not in session right now. And the Duke Energy Progress representative was talking, and when you hear our utility people talk, you realize that they don't profit as much from the new technologies, both because they're new, but also because where's the profit in wind? You can't own it. They already own a lot of the processes for fossil fuels. It kind of shifts the who's seeing economic benefits where, and so I think that has to be considered as a factor in why, as a society, we haven't changed as quickly as some other places.
I think we need to be wrapping
Yeah.
up,
Okay.
but we have
Just
another
two more. I'm
question
sorry.
or
recognize what this might do to them. They're only seeing the money. And this, of course, is what's rampant in this country. This is why we're so far behind the rest of the world, because everybody just wants money. And they don't seem to realize if you area, that money isn't going to do you a lot of good. How can we get people to recognize and to understand the importance of taking care of the atmosphere? How can this be done? This has to be done. And our legislators have to be made to know, look, if you don't vote for what's good for me, you don't get in. And this is where it has to come in. In this area, I find people who just don't, they just sit back and say nothing. And this is the thing that I think has to change, so that people begin to know, look, I have a say, and I can make this guy know, if he doesn't vote for what's good for me, he does not get back in office. This is the only way to do it. And you have to do it sharply and firmly.
I like it. And I think Jim Davis is going to be getting some calls from what I hear. Okay, last.
One quick question for Mike. Can you give me any specific damages that have occurred in that Pennsylvania area? Because if you've got to be able to show more than just facts of what's potential, you've got to be able to show specifics of what's actually occurred.
Yes. And
so what damages can you show us that, or maybe highlight for us that have occurred in Pennsylvania?
Right, and I can get you that list of further readings, but there have been water supplies contaminated with methane. There has been a lot of damage to roads and local infrastructure. There have been communities displaced by the pipelines being constructed. Air pollution. There's one town at least where the whole community's water was basically ruined, and they're having to truck in water. Again, by methane.
May I encourage, please add that in your presentation.
Yes.
Because that is crucial if you're going to market the need for alertness for all of us. And just to know that that's actually occurred.
And I'd be happy to send you some more examples, because it definitely is important to not just guess, but to give some concrete examples. And it's so sad that what has been going on quietly in Pennsylvania, but I think speaking to this lady's statement, we have the benefit that North Carolina can see what happens after you sign the lease 10 years down the road, because it's happening in other places. We can learn from that, and we can hopefully get folks who want to make decisions based on what's going to happen down the road.
I'd like to thank Katie so much for coming.